Sean Wright. I am the Chief Insights and Analytics Officer here at Guideline. What is Guideline? We have a slide on that, so we'll kind of talk to that. But at a high level, I've been with Guideline for about 5 months. And prior to kind of working here, I worked at NBC Universal for a couple of years. Then kind of before that, Anheuser-Busch and a bunch of random other jobs. And at one point too was also DJing kids parties. So bringing that very diverse set of expertise, some of it relevant, some of it not, to our conversation here today. But wanted to kind of give a quick start as to what Guideline is. I know Ruben has presented before, so for folks that have seen this, apologies. But for anybody new, Guideline is kind of 3 discrete tools and systems. We have a business that's really focused on media planning, kind of setting up media plans and figuring out how to optimize, share among your team. It's really, Guideline Lumina and Guideline media tools. We also have, through kind of our media cost product, very granular CPMs, as well as a few other price measures across different aspects of the market, including out of home, radio, and also national components. And then really for today's conversation, we're going to be focusing on mostly within kind of our SMI product, our standard media index. This is really kind of our ad spend ecosystem where we operate today in we operate in 6 countries from a global perspective. And within that, the unique thing about our data is we work directly with media agencies themselves, getting their billing data and then pulling it into our system. So what you see and what you're going to kind of see a little bit of today is not projected. We're not telling you what we think the market is. What we are telling you is across kind of our independent and our large holdcos, what is the billing data that they share with us? We take a little bit of anonymization and standardization so that way we're not exposing any of our contributors and saying, as the data flows in, here's kind of a unique set of ways that we categorize the data from a product category perspective, a media type, and then that way it's uniform and standard. And then we're able to report out exactly what we're seeing in our data across kind of all aspects of the media industry. And that's really kind of today's presentation going to kind of focus and hone in on that in terms of both where we see the market today from an out-of-home perspective and where we ultimately see it going. And we'll kind of touch on a few different things. And then to kind of round things out, we do want to highlight at the end of the presentation that we are launching a new product, focus area really around out-of-home, where we can drill in very specifically on digital out-of-home, and kind of it's a unique product that we're bringing to market that we just wanted to kind of showcase both some insights and where we're at. I would kind of frame it up today as beta. But happy to kind of engage in conversation about that. The other piece that I'll say is during the presentation, I will do my best in terms of monitoring the chat, but feel free to bombard me with questions. If you don't agree with something, if you like something, either way, very open to kind of having that dialogue. And if not, then I'll think everything is great and just keep presenting. So certainly, if things do come up, feel free to ask questions. So the things that we'll do in terms of kicking off is really just first talking about the global state of out-of-home, of what we're seeing in the data. And again, I will be the first to admit that I am certainly not an expert like all of you on the call in terms of out-of-home. I've, played in media space, so at least kind of conversational about it. So if there are things that don't jive, feel free to share that with me. But in terms of some tailwinds, I think no surprise here to anyone in the room we are seeing growth really happening and that shift happening to digital out of home. And that's kind of fueling a lot of growth that we're seeing both globally and in the US. And we'll get to it in terms of some of the methodology, but we're seeing a lot of that growth shifting from really TV and to a lesser extent streaming, which is an interesting call out. We do this exercise a lot across different media types, competitors, and out of home is one of the few that we've seen actually stealing dollars from streaming in terms of shifting budgets. So it's an interesting thing we'll talk about from a tailwind that's fueling a lot of that growth. From a headwind perspective, there's a few things that we're seeing in terms of challenges. One, retention around out of home budgets. despite the growth that we're seeing on digital out of home, we're not necessarily seeing that one for one sourced from losses on the traditional side, which we'll talk to. And so there's a retention opportunity in terms of being able to fuel additional growth. And then also specific to the US, there's this real limitation on digital out of home that's kind of slowing the overall adoption and move that we're seeing there. We'll kind of talk to it in a few slides, but relative to the US as a market overall, globally just has a lot of maturation and therefore a lot of upside in terms of dollars relative to kind of the global out of home market. So huge, I guess, kind of both a headwind and a tailwind. So if we look specifically at some of the kind of the countries that we operate in terms of the global out of home spend, the three largest countries in our data set today are the US, the UK, and China, kind of respectively, and roughly that 40%. 15 and 13% respectively. What's interesting is that the US out of home spend, at least in our data pool, has kind of remained consistently at around 40% since 2017. Maybe a year it goes up in terms of percentage point, goes down, but basically holds pretty steady relative to the overall, data that we can see. But what's fascinating is if you look at all of our data across all media types, the US is about 70% of what we have line of sight to in terms of, overall dollars. And that's again with currency conversion and all of that. But what's fascinating is from an out of home perspective, the US only represents about 39% of our spend today. So there's a mass difference between what we're seeing across the US market overall versus the maturation specifically around out of home, which we think is a tremendous upside in terms of growth. And then to that end as well, in terms of where there's upside, today, in terms of what we have line of sight to, 60% of our global markets that sit outside the US have outpaced growth since 2022, specific to out of home. In the US, essentially, the out of home market has been growing at essentially the exact same rate as the US market overall, kind of going hand in hand at, let's call it roughly 4%. But in a lot of other countries, the UK, many of our European markets, we've seen growth rates as high as anywhere from 8 to 12%. So there's a pretty big difference between what we're seeing in the US versus what we're seeing globally. And again, the unique, interesting thing is that it tends to be the inverse in terms of our data, right? We see one trend happening in the US and others happening globally. Out of home is kind of the inverted of what we're seeing kind of out in the market. So if we look specifically drilling into the US for a couple of slides, if we kind of drill into just 2022 across all of our data that we're looking at for the US, the market was around 3% of all media spend went to out of home. By 2025, that has declined to about 2.7%. What's interesting, though, is that it's not that out of home hasn't grown, right? We go back to that thing that I said the out of home market is growing roughly at the same rate as basically the overall US ad market. So it is growing, but because it's basically keeping exactly at the same rate, out of home has lost a pretty significant amount of market share since 2022 in our data. And we know that kind of the out of home market is larger than just our data, but specific to our data, out of home has lost about 500 million specifically in market share since 2022 and about 1.3 billion since 2017. Again, part of that is kind of shifting into different ad formats, but overall kind of the growth that's happening and accelerating is happening a lot in the digital space around things like social, short form, specifically YouTube, and that's outpacing and kind of moving some of the dollars out of kind of the out of home market. If we break down our kind of visibility into what we see going from 2017, this is kind of the overall view of the ad market in the US and really split between traditional out of home versus digital out of home in terms of placement across the US market. So in 2017, digital out of home was only 7% in a $3.2 billion market. Obviously, the pandemic had a pretty catastrophic impact on the industry. And then fast forward to 2025, we're kind of back in that kind of growth, what would have been likely kind of if the pandemic didn't happen. And digital out of home has now grown to about 20% of the overall market. So healthy, but certainly going back to the earlier statement, if you look at kind of the UK market, the Australia market, digital out of home is a significant larger percentage of the overall pie, which again is why we think part of the growth is happening outside of the US. But in terms of revenue growth for 2025, despite only being 20% of the market in terms of share, 55% of the revenue growth specifically came from digital out of home. And again, I doubt that this is a surprise to anyone on the call. But again, this is just something that we're seeing in our data. Something that I do think is interesting is one thing that we do here at Guideline is a source of volume analysis. So we try to move beyond just talking market share and saying up or down, and really try to understand how budgets are shifting over the course of a year of where allocation is happening. Now, overall, the good news is that out of home is a format where budgets are flowing in and kind of shifting from elsewhere. But still an upside opportunity in terms of overall growth. So if we look uh, at from a digital performance, think search, social, short form, roughly about $105 million that was placed in out of home in 2024 left out of home and moved over to those media formats. So a brand category took maybe a billboard placement or a transit ad and said, you know what, I'm going to move that to social for this year. So kind of roughly to the tune of about $105 million was moved out of home budgets and into there. On the flip side, which is kind of a good story, television, kind of a bucket of all other, CTV are all budgets that we've actually seen flow into out of home. So kind of as the TV market continues to decline, out of home is picking up a large share of those dollars and is being picked up in kind of local markets as it's moving off of kind of the traditional linear space. What is also kind of a call out here is there was roughly about $5 million in our data that kind of just bounced around different out of home. So maybe a category placed it on billboards last year and they took it off billboards, but they still placed it in transit or like place-based advertising this year. So kind of about 5 million just bounced around, and it wasn't really a budget shift so much as it was just reallocation. And specifically where we're seeing the largest growth kind of coming out of that television and CTV space is really kind of heavily concentrated in three, subcategories: airlines, banking, and software. Airlines in particular, something that we saw is huge pops in fairly like warm climates. So we saw kind of the Miami market alone really spiking from an airlines perspective in terms of travel. Banking is really tied to payments and app downloads, like, hey, download our app for our banking thing. And software is kind of an amalgamation of why we think that growth and shift is happening. So it's something that we're seeing kind of overall in the marketplace. And I'm glad to see from a chat perspective that it seems like there's some agreement in terms of not just in our data, but also seeing it kind of across the board. So that's always reassuring that it's not just a data-led insight, but also one that's impacting the industry. So that's one piece. As it relates to AI dollars in terms of digital placement, I would say it's probably too early to say in terms of what we have from a chat GPT perspective and kind of their ad announcement. We had taken a crack at what we think could be the potential market for Gen AI in just year one. I would say overall, probably not a whole lot in year one. Just in terms of what we're seeing and where our kind of bets right now are from a threat perspective is we see those dollars really being sourced from, to TV as well as retail media in terms of things like purchase, click to purchase, and things like that. But it is something that we're monitoring pretty closely. So let me know if, Michael, that addresses your question. So the other piece that we wanted to highlight is if we drill in specifically to kind of traditional out of home, so not just kind of the overall market, but we look just at traditional out of home. When a dollar migrates off of traditional out of home, what's interesting is in our data, only about a penny comes back to digital. So a lot of the growth that we're seeing in digital today from where our kind of data is showing us is a lot of that is incremental and moving budgets from elsewhere, probably other digital media, back into digital out of home, whereas traditional is not being reallocated a one-to-one from a digital perspective, but rather those traditional budgets are actually flowing out of the out of home market overall and moving to things like programmatic, social, search, and other. Do want to call out too, from a programmatic perspective, this is kind of a collection of where we can see things being passed through DSP, but ultimately can't necessarily see where it's going, which is why we call out programmatic separately. We know that programmatic is by type is not a media type, but we did just want to flag that in terms of what we have line of sight into in terms of some of the interest that we're seeing across the board. So we think that there's also a retention opportunity in terms of trying to fight for those dollars to stay within the out-of-home market. But again, the plus side is the market is growing, and it's sourcing from outside in terms of fueling a lot of the digital out-of-home growth. Some categories in terms of winning budgets, because I think this was one of the things that I saw on LinkedIn push and the description of like how to win budgets on specific categories in the digital age. So I love a good quadrant. I don't know if everyone else is a fan, but I always love kind of laying things out from a quadrant perspective. So in terms of what we're looking at here, across the bottom is just a product subcategories out of home spend. Looking from kind of in the far left is really decreasing, cutting budget in out of home. And then on the far right is really increasing and kind of spending a lot more in that space, comparing 2025 to 2024. Across kind of going up and down, we have collectively all of their ad spend that we can see in our tools today, with kind of the bottom left being decreasing and cutting budgets across the board. And then from a total ad perspective, all the way at top is really kind of increasing overall ad budgets. So some interesting call outs is passenger vehicles is something that we're seeing kind of universally cutting across the board. A lot of it really being impacted from tariffs. Not listed here is almost in the same bucket are pharmaceuticals. We're kind of seeing their out of home cuts overall happening at the exact same rate as their overall ad budgets, really tied to some challenges around kind of the recent actions of the FDA. But there are also some interesting diverging strategies that we're seeing in the marketplace. So a couple that we'll call out for the next page is one, non-health insurance. We are seeing them significantly accelerate their out-of-home spend, despite kind of the total ad spend being flat-ish for the year. Similarly, not as significant in terms of growth as discount stores. So think like dollar stores. And then kind of pet food is something where they're actually cutting budgets overall, but growing out of home specifically. Not to say that this would happen overnight. And let's be honest, trying to kind of win dollars from a share shift and driving incremental revenue is a very tough thing. But just to give you a sense of if we looked at all of our categories today and getting them to that fair share of around 3% for out of home would equate to about $1.3 billion incrementally in spend from what we can see. And again, very clear, not saying that like just go out and do it. Obviously, that's more challenging than that. But wanted to kind of highlight the three specific categories that we wanted to call out from a interesting perspective. So one, non-health insurance. What we've seen in terms of and what we've heard in terms of some of the strategy here is they're really moving to hyper targeted kind of geographic based focus. So kind of a natural play for something like out of home that's place based, very much tied to geography. And part of that is really pressure that we're hearing and seeing around insurance and premiums. In some places, the non-health insurance, think like bundlers. So your autos, your home insurances, the Geicos, the Progressives, the Liberty Mutuals. We're seeing them exit whole markets, right? Part of California, Florida. And so they're very interested in then going into places where they see their business as still continually being profitable. And there's a kind of both a massive shift that we've seen this category play towards out of home. But on top of that, even with that massive shift, they're still pretty significantly undershared from a media mix perspective. And if out of home were to capture its fair share of this subcategory, it would equate to about 107 million annually. The second is discount stores. This is also a place where we think there's some natural kind of place-based. I used place twice in a sentence. This is a category where we think there's some place-based opportunity as well, given that there's a lot of signposting, come to visit the store. Here's kind of some of the price discounts we have for et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of this growth is really being fueled by consumer shifts. So as economic pressures mount, as inflation really hasn't gone down, we're seeing increasingly consumers shifting to discount stores to do a lot more of their purchasing. And so we're seeing these stores in turn start to kind of push advertising into areas that maybe historically they didn't do. Today, if a lot of them operate in food deserts, we're starting to see them kind of edge out and push into more of the suburban markets to try to capture that share of folks interested in shopping there. And then pet food and pet care, really kind of the thinking here is that it's being driven primarily from vitamins and supplements, not necessarily kind of the food brown rocks, as you might, but more kind of the broader space, as that has really surged over the last year, growing about 56% overall from a revenue perspective, not an ad. So we think there's some upside there. And again, from a fair share, opportunity, around 42 million overall, 41. So from an outlook perspective, overall, we do some fancy math, and then we also kind of layer in some economic variables and indicators, GDP forecast, to do our what is now going to be our annual kind of global forecasting. So for the U.S. market today, we forecast it to be about 4% growth. That 4% is specific to our kind of data. So really kind of those large independents plus holdcos. This isn't necessarily kind of accounting for that long tail of small customers. So again, our view is around 4% growth. I guess the silver lining, good news, is that in the growth formats, we're expecting almost 7% of growth. Out of home is really the only one that's not digital native that is expected to grow this year in terms of overall health of the market, and that's inclusive of both traditional and digital out of home. Where we're seeing also on the flip side a declining market continuing happening in traditional formats, so radio, print, and linear, as those markets continue to contract. If you were to strip out the World Cup and Olympics, which we think will be a pretty significant boost to the overall ad market in the US, our forecast would shrink to about 2% growth. And a lot of that really coming at the back end of the year, when we think to like end of Q3, Q4, after the World Cup is gone, and maybe some of the economic headwinds catch up from a consumer behavior perspective. We're expecting a slowdown to happen around there. Overall, in terms of out of home, we would expect the kind of market to continue to grow. Our forecast today is to kind of tap out at around 4 billion overall. And again, kind of that diverging path of the traditional, we're really forecasting to grow at around 1.5%, while digital out of home, we're expecting to grow almost 15. And those are pretty consistent with what we've seen in the last few years in terms of breaking out from a forecast. In regards to March Madness, Paul, we're really kind of seeing that as not necessarily incremental, given that it has happened for, it's one of those that happens in the same way that the Super Bowl. It's not really driving incremental revenue per se, and we're kind of expecting it to be marginally up versus the prior year. But I say that, and I think the Super Bowl was probably up around 8 or 9%, which is not marginal. So we'll see kind of from a March Madness perspective what happens, especially around pricing. In terms of the macroeconomic outlook, we also do category forecasts. And so highlighting a few spaces here that I think are of interest is auto. We're expecting to continue to face some headwinds despite the tariffs being ruled as being unconstitutional. We expect some kind of continued challenges happening, and kind of seeing pressure in that category. Where I would highlight, literally in the yellow box, a few things that I think are interesting from an out-of-home perspective is one, alcohol. We've seen kind of shifts happening in local DMAs that we're seeing boosts to happen there, despite alcohol overall kind of being flattish. So there might be an opportunity there. Online betting, obviously pretty geo-based at this point, given some of the legality. But as a deep dive in Q4, the Kansas City DMA in particular saw a pretty wild jump in ad spend around out of home and our local TV, specifically because they started allowing online betting. So we think that as those markets come on board, it's always an opportunity to kind of capture incremental spend in those DMAs. At least right now, from like a legality perspective, there isn't much in terms of the legislative docket on a state by state that we would expect additional DMAs to come online right now. There's a few things that are kind of being talked about in some of the state houses, but nothing that I would point to be like, these are the next 3 DMAs. But it is something that we're watching from a growth perspective. In terms of gambling, here we are only referencing it, from a online betting to be your sports apps, DraftKings, all of those things. Predictive markets are not part of our categorization in terms of online betting, as far as I know, but I could always follow up with our engineering team. From a travel perspective, kind of going back to that Miami example, huge pops. in specific DMAs, mostly kind of warm weather DMAs. I don't know how many people are going to look at a billboard in Boston in December and go, yeah, that's where I want to go. But we are seeing this kind of pop in a lot of the kind of the more southern DMAs, specifically around airlines. So something to kind of look at in terms of growth around specifically billboards. And from a finance perspective, really kind of drilling into that banking and even further kind of payments, push to app. That's where we're seeing a lot of these ads kind of pop up across the board. So those would be some highlights that we would think from a category perspective. So what's next? Some of the cool razzle dazzle of what we're kind of moving along on from an out of home perspective here at Guideline. So I'm going to kind of play a video. But kind of as a last thing, we are launching. We're name TBD. I'm not a marketer. We'll tap in the marketers to name this something cooler. Right now, we're calling it our digital out of home pool, which is confusing because it's actually just a deeper cut of out of home, inclusive of digital, than what we have today. But it is a unique data asset that we're kind of launching, where we are giving DMA level insights. Here's an example, live fire, of kind of the different things that you can look at within our tool today. In terms of navigating the platform, it'll be a combination of both kind of canned reports that you can look at and just say what's market share by each of the DMAs or national. And then kind of then even getting into manipulating some of the data itself and playing around with it and saying, like, what are my eCPMs? What are all overall impressions? But it has kind of a lot there. We also have things like frequency, different ad formats, indicators of whether or not those ad formats are digital or traditional. But this is a product that we kind of have in beta at the moment. If interested in terms of talking more about either being a contributor to the panel, similar to how we have our overall agency contributor model, and or interested in kind of subscribing to some of the data, bless you. It's something that we can kind of talk about. And then again, just kind of drilling into the data that we have today. Something that is unique about this data asset that we don't have in kind of our more of our agency pool is we can start to get really deep on the digital cuts of data. And so today, using our data in terms of what we have visibility into, here are our top DMAs that we can see in this new product based on digital out of home index. So if we kind of go back to digital out of home within our data being roughly about 20%, Boston is kind of the most digital enabled environment from a DMA perspective of what we have visibility and line of sight into today. There's nothing to do with this data. I just thought it was interesting. Maybe you do too. If you don't, that's also good feedback too, as we build this out and try to figure out what resonates. If you guys tell me that this stinks, it's always welcomed. But that's kind of everything I got. Thank you for having us, Ruben. I don't know if you had anything to add, but I certainly appreciate coming here and talking to y'all.
Yeah, hey, I just wanted to add something about where we're getting our data and why it's important. So our data currently on the SMI pool comes from buyers of media. What's unique about the digital out of home product is, and the reason we did this is the media buyers and the way that it's recorded in the billing systems can't really bring out true light in terms of the digital out of home spend and where money is flowing, because things get grouped together. And because we're pulling directly from billing and invoicing systems, there was kind of this black box around digital out of home. And so what's really unique about digital out of home is that we're still dependent on contributors, but this is coming from the sell side. So this is coming from the publishers that are selling the data, and what we return back to people for contributing is, and we're at the stage where when we build a product, we're at a give to get model. So we sign agreements where people give us the data, and then we return back their data indexed against standard taxonomies, as well as how they compare to, the global pool of data. So we already have, contributors on the product. There's a few folks that I've met at the DPAA that have that I've been speaking to that are interested in contributing. We're still at the stage where we think there's room for niche players, for other players to come in and take advantage of this while it's still in the give to get model. Once it's fully commercialized, it's of course available and can be used. But that's it. Jesse Swartfub from Dentsu, who you've highlighted, is one of our super users, and we love working with her as well. She's brilliant. But we appreciate the opportunity, and I do think specifically for this community, this represents a very unique opportunity to get involved at the ground before it's fully commercialized.
That is great. Thank you both so much. Great presentation, Ruben. Thank you. Please stay in touch with these folks, and let's make sure that we give them the robust data. And there was so much there, and I think there's going to be a while to unpack it. I've got a couple of questions and a couple of people I like Sean and Ruben, you folks to meet with as well, which you sparked some interest. The index by market, Sean, could you give me, maybe because I sneezed, but what was that based upon?
If today the current digital out of home average is around 20%, Boston, I can't do the mental math.
20% share of media
Digital out of
market.
home. So yeah, of digital out of home as a percentage of out of home.
Oh, it's a percentage of out of home. Okay, so that's an index of the percentage of digital out of home versus out of home spend in each of those DMAs.
Yep. And so Boston would be, and again, mental math is not my strong suit, which I know is not really probably a thing to lead with as an analytics guy, but yes, it would be, let's make it up, 28% in Boston.
I think you're better at mental math than you give yourself credit for. I think everybody would agree on this.
And I'll be at the event tomorrow, so looking forward to seeing anyone. And if anyone's interested in chatting, I'm there. I'll also be in New York, so anyone who wants to chat further, happy to do so. And thanks to you guys for giving us this opportunity.